Hi everyone, and welcome to another Microsoft Reactor live stream. My name is Nadia and I will be your host for today's session. But before we dive into our main event, I'd like to remind everyone about the Reactor Code of Conduct. Our aim is to cultivate a positive and inclusive environment for all participants. So please let's keep our interactions respectful and supportive. Today we are joined by MJ, who's running his third session on the Let's Talk Vector series, and this will be focusing on Pgvector. If you have missed MJ's previous series, I will share the links in the comment section for you. Throughout the session, feel free to drop your questions in the chat and we'll do our best to address as many as possible. We'll also be sharing additional resources and links in the chat, including information on how you can become Microsoft MVP. For those who want to revisit today's session, you can catch the recording later on our Reactor YouTube channel. So without further ado, I'd like to give a warm virtual round of applause to our lovely speaker, MJ. Over to you, MJ.
Hey Nadia, thanks for introducing me. And hello everyone. Again, I'm so excited. It is my third time, talking about this very passionate topic of mine about vector database, right? So let me share my screen. Unfortunately, I'm just using one screen at the moment. But Nadia, let me know if I'm already sharing my slides or desktop at the moment.
Yeah, you're all good, MJ.
Okay, cool. All right, thanks everyone. Thanks, Nadia. Okay, so for today, I'll be talking about Pgvector or Postgres. A quick introduction about myself. I'm the type of person who's been around Microsoft ecosystem for a long time now, but never an FTE yet. And lately, I'm into all this data and AI space. And I've seen a lot of these technologies evolve before Azure came to be, before all these new technologies came into be. So I have a lot of experience to show. And for today, previously, we've talked about introduction or general introduction about vector databases, and in particular, the use of Azure AI search for kind of like an out-of-the-box experience and like a lot of clickings or like a no coding experience required. And then last month, we talked about Quadrant, which is a native vector database. And despite it being native, how does it really fit within the Azure ecosystem? So we talked about different deployment methods and how that could work. And just to recap, and this like the horizon or a vector database in a page at the moment, and there are a lot of options out there, right? And probably we can't talk about all of this, at the end of the year, but we'll try our best to kind of like cater as much as possible. So if you look at it, last month we talked about Quadrant, which is a pure vector database, and like Azure OpenAI or AI search falls under this category around text search DB. And now we're going to talk about vector capable SQL DBs, which is around PostgreSQL. However, for those who are familiar with Postgres and depending on your level of exposure to Postgres, a lot would argue that Postgres is not just a SQL database. That's why you might hear some of my nomenclature saying that it's Postgres, not PostgreSQL. So you might hear me say that a lot because I am kind of like fascinated. I really like working with Postgres data storage. PostgreSQL, SQL is one of them. All right. But then if you look at Postgres and why this works, if Postgres is one of those open source projects out there that's kind of like loved. It's not just liked. I would say it's like loved by a lot of people. Like it's one of those open source projects which is getting very least amount of I would say dissatisfaction, right? And it has a really big ecosystem throughout the years. And within Azure itself, there's a lot of different options where Postgres can be hosted. And like, for example, there's Flex Server, which I'll show you a bit later. And there's also Cosmos DB, which with the Citus extension. And obviously you can use virtual machines as well. And also lately there's that option around using Azure Arc to manage your kind of like on-prem or remote Postgres database as well, or non-Azure cloud Postgres instances. So I guess Postgres is kind of like one of those first-class citizen data store within Azure, right? And it's there's so many options out there with Postgres, and it's a very vibrant community. Um, for today, we'll be talking about this particular extension, right? It's called Pgvector. So Pgvector is technically an extension, right? Just like a lot of those other extensions in Postgres. For those who are familiar with Postgres and for those who aren't, Postgres itself supports a lot of different extensions. There are like extensions to support JSON arrays. There are extensions to support, running Python code as a kind of like cron job running within the database server itself. There's like extensions to handle redundancies and so on and so forth, right? But vector store or vector capabilities itself is not within Postgres out of the box, right? Not at least right now with Postgres 15 and 16, version 15 and 16. It's not yet included, right? So that means that you need an extension to activate this. And that extension is called Pgvector. So that's this Pgvector extension is available through that GitHub link, pgvector/pgvector. But I'll also show you how to easily install it within your Postgres database. So some of the key features of Pgvector is that it supports high-speed vector calculations, supports for more complex vector operations, and probably the most important feature of this one is it's very seamless integrating it with your existing PostgreSQL in particular, PostgreSQL instance out there, whether it's in Azure or not, right? So that key term, seamless integration, that means you don't have to learn a new database, new way of setting it up, right? So that means once you have a Postgres instance already running, you don't actually need to learn a new platform just to host a vector data store. Okay, so that's a very powerful key feature of Pgvector. And other features that's very relevant in this space at the moment is that it supports HSNW, which is kind of like newish. So last year, this is not yet supported. Back then, it only supports IVF flat, and basically HSNW, it's kind of like a fast retrieval way, especially when you're working with a big amount of vectors, and you're trying to do vector similarity or, KNN or nearest neighbor search. With HSNW, it allows you to do it very fast. Um, but that also comes with a little bit drawback wherein like it kind of like caters a higher memory requirements. And that just means that, you consume more memory when doing HSNW. Um, the other features as well that I really love is SDKs for the non-Python ecosystem out there, because all these vector databases most likely they are supporting Python, Python libraries here and there. Working with LangChain, working with OpenAI Python, and all those kind of like usual Python libraries out there. They're kind of like supported this vector space, right? But for Pgvector, it has first class support SDKs, right? It's not even an API level, it's like SDK level for .NET, Java, which is again very important, especially if you have already existing instances, existing applications that you just want to extend capabilities using vector. And for those who are in the Microsoft and .NET ecosystem, you would be very happy that there's support things like Entity Framework and Dapper, as well as NPG, NPG SQL to get packaged. So all those kind of like .NET familiarity is still in there, and you're just kind of like implementing a different kind of like set of methods, right? So it's not about learning a new technology. It's just learning new sets of classes and methods and properties. All right. Before obviously now I'm gonna go to the demo, which is gonna be the rest of the 30, 40 minutes of my conversation. So first, let's go to Azure. Okay, if I can, avoid that parallax. So all right. So first things first, there are, again, just like I told earlier, there are multiple ways to host Postgres within Azure. So if you actually look at you know Postgres and search for this, sorry, if you want to, like for example, if you're creating a new resource and you search for Postgres SQL, um, within and outside Microsoft ecosystem, like let's say you just want to pick the Azure services only. So there's this Azure database for PostgreSQL. This is kind of like a single instance database. It's I don't recommend using this at the moment for many reasons. But the major reason for this one is that it's kind of like a statically sized database out there that comes with different level of SKUs. Like you have to buy in a certain tier to actually kind of like get scale this one. My preference is that if you're kind of like starting your journey, I would go with a flexible server, Azure database for PostgreSQL flexible server, because if you create this, right, I'll just type that in. Right? And like if you, let's say, a production instance can start at around 274 USD, or if for development purposes, you can go as low as $16 per month, right? So that's why having this, option, the flexible server is probably the best way to go if you're just starting out Postgres on Azure. And you can choose specific versions and workload types, like production, large size, and small and medium, right? And then there's like this burstable capabilities out there wherein you can kind of like create a very powerful 20 vcores 80 GB Postgres database. And then you can also set up HA or high availability, and you can also do local redundancies within that region of of that Postgres database. But then there's also that option to do geo redundancy. But if you come to think of it, this geo redundancy is just in the point of view of HA and disaster recovery. It's not really about scaling your application to kind of like multiple instances across different regions. So for that specific reason, if your Postgres instance will be consumed worldwide and would be um, requiring that multiple kind of like instances across different regions from day one, then the option that you're probably looking for is this one, the Azure Cosmos DB for Postgres SQL, right? This one basically leverages the power of Azure Cosmos DB, but at the same time, that's enabled using this extension called Citus, CITUS, that allows it to kind of like scale your Postgres instance to multiple geographical kind of like scale. Um, it's very similar approach being used by some of those database as a service services out there. I won't name them, but they're kind of like using the same technology to scale their the your Postgres database horizontally. Uh, okay, so that just means that the obvious downside is that with a one node with no HA but already globally scalable, global footprint already, you're looking at 238 USD per month, right? And again, it's just because that kind of like scale comes with its own kind of like merits of cost. So again, if you're just using Postgres for development, I would highly suggest go to the um, Flex server option rather than this Cosmos DB option, right? Okay. Then before I move on to Vector itself, I also want to show you if you again if you do a search for Postgres and I just click Azure Services only. So there's this um, Azure Database for PostgreSQL Azure Arc. Okay, so this one is about and again this is currently in preview. The idea here is that you can kind of like connect to an on-prem instance or like a different instance of Postgres database out there, whether it's out it's things like outside of Azure or on your own data center and stuff. Um, then through Arc, you can kind of like manage the whole Postgres database for you as if it's kind of like within Azure. So similar experience of it and like having all this kind of like portal experience. And not to mention, it also supports Arc-enabled Kubernetes cluster. So if you're in a Kubernetes environment, this is also an option for you, right? So it's an easier way for you to kind of like manage your Postgres instance. All right, now let's go to the actual Pgvector capabilities. So in here, I have Rider open. Okay, so Rider is an IDE by JetBrains. It's primarily for .NET development. Um, and in particular, I opened this project called Pgvector.net, which is available in GitHub. You just have to search for pgvector.net. And in particular, we'll be running a lot of these tests. Wherein I'm gonna explain to you these different tests about using NPG, SQL, Dapper, and Entity Framework, right? And with that, I also set up, well, first off, I have a local instance of Postgres on my Mac. So I have the actual Postgres application, but the Docker image instance is also can work fine. But I just prefer this to use, let's talk, to use the Azure app, sorry, the local Mac app for Postgres. It's just easier to manage in my point of view, at least works for me. And then in terms of interfacing with the database, I'm using this tool called uh, DataGrip. So DataGrip is, again, it's a JetBrains product that's specific for data sources, right? Um, so the key call out here is that obviously if you're not in this ecosystem, that should be fine. But like this .NET code can also work with Visual Studio, VS Code, especially if you're in the Windows. And if you don't have Data Grip, you can also have an option to use things like Table Plus or Azure Data Studio. Just in Azure Data Studio, just make sure to enable the Postgres extension as well, so that you can interface with it. And obviously, there's that OG Postgres tool, which is the pgadmin. So that's why bear with me. If data grip and Rider is not something you're familiar with, I'll try to answer if there are like specific IDE questions out there. When I get to the latter part of the presentation. But within data grip, I connected to these three different databases that I created. So one is I'm connected to localhost. The other one is I'm connected to the Azure database Flex server. And the last one is the Azure Cosmos DB with Citus extension, which is, that allows Postgres to scale horizontally. So I've connected to localhost. And the key thing here in Pgvector is that you need to have enabled the vector extension. And that means that if you actually get that working, if you expand to database objects and extensions, you should have the vector extension installed, right? It's literally called vector. So you can't get wrong with that. So the extension is called vector. Okay. So how do you actually create that? How do you actually enable that extension? Well, there are a couple of options, right? Like literally, you can just do a new query console, and then from there, you can just enable the extension itself. But let's jump to the code, and I'll show you first. Is I've used the npg SQL within that local host instance. Okay, so this is a test class. All right, that basically comes with the connection string, which is just the localhost database Postgres. And this line of code is just about creating an instance of it, and this one's about creating that connection. Then using npg SQL command, think of it like a simple executor of any kind of like raw SQL statements, right? So if you wanna run this, create extension if not exist vector. So this is something you can run towards the query console in again in your database IDE. But using npg SQL in .NET, you can actually invoke this command directly, right? You just have to pass in the connection, and obviously the whole connection string. Then you just do this command that execute non-query async, okay? And then you reload your connection. Then if you wanna kind of like just keep on invoking more and more kind of like commands with the power of .NET with its async await, you can just kind of like run them sequentially like this, wherein you can have the npg SQL. Let's say you want to drop the table called items, and then from there, after dropping the table, you can create the table with ID serial primary key. And here's the most important bit. So for all those listening out there, the most important bit here, if you're using npg SQL, is that the data type embedding is what you would use. All right. With a vector size of, let's say, of 3, right? So this is kind of like the magic class for the .NET devs out there to use to kind of like support this kind of like vector operations. Um, I'm not gonna go into the details again of what vector is and what sort of like storage it's used and like things like that. But in particular, right, this vector is where you're storing the chunk of your embeddings. In particular, let's say in a Word document, you want to chunk them per paragraph or per sentence, and like you want to kind of like capture that whole sentence use Azure OpenAI, something like Ada 002 to create an embedding version of that. So let's say that sentence called, let's talk vectors is awesome, gets converted into a bunch of like vector representation of integers and numbers. Um, and then you save that embedding through a vector store, such as, again, in this case, we're talking about Postgres database, but in particular with Pgvector, it now supports that with kind of like a more kind of like native capability instead of kind of like serializing it to kind of like JSON and then putting it as a kind of like text, and then you deserialize it and stuff like that. So that means that when you're trying to insert records, most likely, sorry, not integer, float um, data types, then you just have to insert all of them into those um, embeddings um, kind of like class. And again, the thing there is that the important bit here is the size. So this is like the size. So that is, like that means that how many values that are you putting into your vector storage, right? And this needs to be consistent so that, whenever you're doing a search, it's always kind of like performing that within that specific size of vector embedding table. And then here you can perform a select statement and kind of like, just list them and assert that they're kind of like equal. In this case, we done some assertions about, that the first array one is 1 1 1, second is, 1112 and 2222, which should be correct in here. Okay. All right. Now, you can also use indexes using IBF flat. So this is, for those who are not familiar with IBF flat, you have to, well, IBF flat is a very efficient way of storing and kind of like searching vector indexes. But the kind of like downside of it, or not the downside, is that you just need to make sure you need to manually create this index for you, right? Like you need to set up these indexes in order to use IBFF flat. Compared to HSNW, it's kind of like out of the box, right? When you're just kind of like saving it into an embedding, it's automatic for you. And yeah, there you go. So copy items. Then from there, you select, perform a select, and things like that. A search like value was either too large or too small. So if we run this test, okay, run the unit test, okay, it's successful. So if we look at the database in DataGrip, localhost. So remember, we created a table called items, right? So it's gonna fall under that table. And if you double click on the items itself, you can see that these are stored, right? Like the 1, 2, 3, 111, so on and so forth, right? So if you think of it this way, this is just how simple vector is, right? You're just literally saving a data type that supports this format, which is like, like a multi array, or like again, that kind of like a multi, yeah, it's an array type of thing, right? And it's again natively, or the kind of like from this you can perform your search and stuff like that. So that's as simple as it can be, right? So, and that's by design. Pgvector needs to be very simple, and that's why I'm liking this approach, because again, I don't have to learn a new database. I don't have to learn a new programming language, new paradigm. I just need to learn how to create an embedding, and from there, I just need to a way to store these embeddings into a data store, and I just need a way to kind of like retrieve them as well. All right. So with that, okay, maybe I'll take a few minutes, like next 5 minutes, to do question Q&A. Nadia, let me just unshare my screen so I don't, um, you know, look funny. Okay. All right. Let me look at the comments. Okay, slides could be a bit bigger. Okay. Okay. Let me hide that button. Sorry. All right. Okay. All right. So that's fine. No questions at the moment specific about Pgvector so far. Okay. I'll just carry on with the presentation. Okay. Let me share. Okay. Let me share my screen again.
Oh,
There
you
you go.
did get one question come through, MJ, from
Okay.
Rajesh. Can Pgvector is used for multi-model embeddings?
Yes, it can be, right? And it's probably one of the good use cases as well, because the Pgvector, first and foremost, is kind of like model agnostic. So it's not meant to just support Azure OpenAI or OpenAI embeddings. So for as long as it's a vector representation like this, it should be supported, right? Because again, the Pgvector capability is embedded again as a generic data type, and it's not, the embeddings capability and conversion of embeddings is not something enabled, or like comes with the whole Pgvector straight away. So that bit, you have the freedom to choose whatever embedding model you want, and but then again, at the same time, that comes with its own responsibility, knowing which one you use. So for example, if you use fast embed versus OpenAI or another embedding capability, you just need to make sure you know which. At the end of the day, it's again just a store for you. All right. Shall I carry on, Nadia?
Yep, good to go, MJ.
Okay. All right. Cool. Thanks. Thanks for the question. Now I'll go into the database Flex server. Um, One thing that you have to make sure of, and this is a bit tricky, is that with Flex server, or this also applies to single instance Postgres database, is that you need to, the way extensions work with flexible server and single instance Postgres is that it doesn't support every extension out there, right? And this is very important uh, for those who are using Azure database for Postgres, right? So in order to enable Pgvector and all other extensions out there, you actually need to go to the server parameters settings within Azure, right? And then you search for Azure, and then there you go. You need to look at Azure extensions, right? And I'll open that link, right? But basically, if you look at it, these are all the extensions that are supported um, by Azure Database for Postgres Flex Server, right? So if you look at it, it's not a lot. There's Azure AI, by the way, in there, and that list is here. It's in Microsoft Learn, and there you go. So the thing is, these extensions, right? They can actually be enabled using Azure CLI, right? That and also enabled with using ARM templates. So if you're in that kind of like landing zone concept or like infrastructure as code, this can be enabled for you, right? You don't have to run an SQL script to enable all of this, right? But then the downside is that there's only certain extensions available out there, and they're kind of like pre qualified by Microsoft or the Azure team in particular. So you just have to make sure that when you're using Azure Postgres Flex Server, you need if you're using specific extensions, just make sure that they exist here, right? So in this case, Vector, which is Vector, is supported, right? So just to make sure and in case, because when you try to run the SQL statement on Azure, right? The database itself, it's not gonna work unless you manually have to enable that for you in this server parameters. Or again, when you created the database through infrastructure as code with either PowerShell or CLI or ARM templates. Okay, so again, just need to make sure you've enabled that feature here, right? So why is that? Why is Postgres Flex servers a bit restricting? So the reason for it is that the actual Flex server comes with a bunch of this different kind of like databases as well, right? So not just the Postgres database is the one that's kind of like out of the box, or I would say comes with it out of the box when you created the Flex server instance. But if you look here, you have this Azure SIS and Azure maintenance. So these are specific objects out there, right? That allows Azure to maintain Postgres for you without having to worry about all these scaling capabilities and all these telemetries and stuff like that, like PG availability and so on and so forth, right? So that's why there's a bit of restriction around that area, because all of this kind of like platforming capability for you is managed by Azure. Right? So again, just be mindful that using Flex Server, you a lot of this are not managed for you. Sorry, they're already managed for you. That also means that if you look at things like let me expand this. If you look things like extensions, you have this PGAAD auth in Azure, right? So that means that the access management of a Flex Server database is handled by Azure using Azure Active Directory, or what we call now Entra, right? So all of these capabilities are managed for you so that, let's say you forget the password, right? You can just go back to the portal and, hey, let me reset the password, right? So under the hood, what happens here is that Azure is kind of like a supersede user that kind of like allows you to interact through the portal and perform a lot of these capabilities at the left without having to worry with the underlying platform work for that, such as migration, upgrades, replication, and so on and so forth. Specifically in terms of backup and restore, this is something that's allowed for you by Flex Server. So that means you can kind of like create backups periodically every day, and set some retention policies such as one month or 60 days. So you don't have to worry about that. Okay, now back to the code. Okay, so for this one, I use Dapper, um, which is a kind of like a lightweight ORM, or object relational mapper, in .NET, that allows you to kind of like interface with the Postgres database without, you know, it's it's kind of like a lightweight way to run SQL queries, but at the same time do kind of like a high level object mapping between a class and a table, right? So in this case, like Dapper item can be a table represented as a table, right? And in this case, with Dapper, right? By the way, in terms of like the actual extensions that you have to install in NuGet, you have to make sure you have the Pgvector um, extension, or NuGet package for NPGSQL, right? Just to show that again. Sorry. And the Pgvector Dapper, which is kind of like an extension if you're using Dapper. Okay. So basically here, what happens is that this part here is very similar to before, wherein you just kind of like set up a connection to the database, and then you very similarly you can do something like connection execute, create extension if that exists, drop table, Dapper items, create table, then create a new embeddings, insert them into the Dapper items um, um, table, right? And then there you go. So with Dapper, right, you have this capability to perform a query, right, and assign it to a list of Dapper items, which is this one, wherein kind of like the Dapper item table is mapped to this Dapper item class, kind of like magically, right? And then from there, you can do your assertions and so on and so forth, right? So if we run this, right, Dapper test, run this unit test. Okay, successful. So let's look at our database. And in particular, let's look at Dapper items table. Okay. So that means that in this database, the Flex server, similar to localhost, just have to enable the vector extension. Once you have that extension enabled, and then if you look at tables here, that's not the one I'm looking for. Let me refresh this one. Oh, wait, sorry. Okay. Actually, I use Dapper with Cosmos DB. So, okay. Just have to make sure. Let me just go back to this one. Yes, sorry. Yep, it's a C dash. So I use Cosmos DB for Dapper. So now let's just quickly jump into DataGrip again and go into Citus Azure Cosmos DB and go into the Citus database. Let me refresh that. Sorry, it should be in the public, not the Citus object. Okay, and look at tables. There you go. So we got these Dapper items in here. Okay, same thing. IDs and embeddings, right? Very similar to how you do it with NPGSQL. Now, okay, because I already covered Dapper, right, let me just go into the code again and now explain entity framework, right? So just wanna quickly go back here. So EF, our entity framework, is kind of like a very popular database ORM out there. And it's primarily rooted towards SQL Server in the past and Azure SQL, but there's also support for Postgres database, which is really nice. And if you look at the code here, one of the advantages of using EF, and if you're in the .NET space for a while, you have a lot of this kind of like dot notations, a lot of this kind of like more fluent type of programming paradigm, wherein like model builder has Postgres extension, then type in vector, so you don't have to type the whole kind of like script. Then you can do things like map the entity item, which is again this one, public class item, ID, and column embedding type vector tree. So to support this, you need to make sure you also have the Pgvector entity framework core, so that you'll have this capability to kind of like decorate or create a column attribute with with a custom name and type name, which is something like vector, and tree with the size of tree. And that you also have this vector class and the embedding object. All right, so very similar. This part is just about setting it up. This is about having to choose H and SW, which we've covered a bit earlier, and it also has that has operator, has storage parameter, and EF construction. All right. So now if we do this again, so first is you need to create the item context. Then from there, you need to, if you look at item context, this is the class, right? Which inherits the DB context. So for those who are into EF or not familiar with EF, we have this concept of context, right? That allows you to kind of like abstract the whole database, and this CTX or this context allows you to kind of like interface with it. So you can still execute SQL. So even if you're using entity framework, you're not stuck to just using all the ORM capabilities. You can still execute SQL queries out there. But then for those in the .NET world, this is very kind of like flavorful programming paradigm about getting dependency injection with the get service, iRelational database creator, and so on and so forth, right? Um, so you can do your assertions in here, and then you can do an a more complex set of operations or testing in here, and then do that assertions. And then in this case, you can have the KNN, like a nearest neighbor search, with the .L2 distance. So yeah, it has that flexibility for you. Okay, so let me run this test with Entity Framework Core. So with EF Core, and going back to this one, let me just close this off with the Flex server. So if we look at the Postgres public tables, so EF Core items are in there, and there you go, right? You support same thing, supporting embedding of type vectors. All right, just to close off, um, with Azure Cosmos DB with Citus. Again, it's very important that to know that what makes these Azure Cosmos DB a bit different from the Flex server is that it's horizontally scaling. So it has this Citus extension that allows that capability. All right. So if you look at database objects, look at extensions. So it has a lot of extensions for you. Citus is just one of them. But one of the advantage of Citus Azure Cosmos DB versus the Flex server is that you have the freedom to install a bunch of different extensions for you, right? You don't have to go through the portal to enable them, right? So you have this Earth distance that allows you to, perform some GIS capabilities. Yeah, so that's why, yeah, there's also an advantage of using Citus with a lot of those extended extensions out there. All right. Okay, so let me wrap this up. If I go to the Azure portal, just want to show you this as well. In the Citus Azure Cosmos DB for PostgreSQL cluster. And again, if you come to think of it, if you're working with Cosmos DB, it's always a cluster, not a database server. So you're kind of like always working in multiple instances all the time. One thing that I want to show you here is that there's also that authentication capability with Entra, okay, with Postgres, but you can also add some specific Postgres SQL role in here, right? If you actually look at the Flex server, right, and let's say, where was that? Authentication. Yes. So within Flex server, you can only nominate Entra admins. But then in Citus, you have an option to kind of like create a lower level type of like Postgres role for you out of the box within the portal. But you can still do interface that within the Data Studio or the IDE. Okay, let me wrap this up. Let me just from current slide. So in conclusion, I would highly recommend that if you're familiar with Postgres and you're in that ecosystem already, this is a very straightforward approach to be introduced with vectors and vector databases and vector stores. And there are a lot of options out there in Azure to host your Postgres instance. And I mentioned earlier, the advantages of each of these options. And probably the only downside I'm seeing at the moment is it doesn't support some highly specialized vector operations yet. Things like, embeddings out of the box, or things like certain algorithms besides KNN or nearest neighbor search. But then again, right, like it's just a matter of time until those specific highly specialized operations will be supported. Otherwise, maybe you don't even have to come across those at some point, right? Maybe it's just a simple, recommendation engine, or like just a storage of your RAG documents, right? And things like that. So with that, thank you very much, and let's continue the conversation. I'll stop sharing now and I'll go back to the studio.
Thanks so much for that, MJ. We haven't had any other questions come through yet. But if you did have any, feel free to pop them in. We'll be around for like another couple of minutes or so. And if you do want to come back and watch a recording of this session, you will be able to see it within the next 24 hours on our YouTube channel as well. But yeah, thank you so much again, MJ, for sharing that, and keep an eye out for MJ's next session on Let's Talk Vector Series. That'll be coming in May.
Yes, for those watching right now, so the next session will be about Fabric, Microsoft Fabric. So it's another exciting platform for me. It's a very talked topic these days about Microsoft Fabric, but then how do you actually marry it up with things like vector databases and vectors and like Azure OpenAI? So stay tuned for that one, and I'll see you there next month. Looking forward to it.
Sounds good. Thanks so much, MJ. And thank you everyone for joining, and we will speak to you all soon. Bye for now.
Bye.